The council chamber floated in the void between stars, a massive structure that had witnessed 3,000 years of galactic peace and cooperation among the civilized worlds. Today, that peace was dying. Premier Savik stood at the central podium, her crystalline form refracting the emergency lights that bathed the chamber in crimson warnings. Around her, representatives from 47 species watched the holographic display with mounting horror. The Vorash swarm had broken through the outer rim. 17 worlds had gone silent in the past lunar cycle. Fleets that had defended the Concordat for centuries were simply disappearing into clouds of biological matter that consumed everything in their path. "We have exhausted conventional options," Savik's voice resonated through the translation matrix, reaching every delegate in their native language. "Our projections show complete defensive collapse within 6 standard months." Months? Commander Korath of the Zalathian Empire slammed his four-armed bulk against his seat's restraints. "Then we fight to the last ship. We evacuate what we can and retreat to the core worlds." "And abandon billions?" Ambassador Telrant's feathers ruffled with agitation. "The swarm doesn't take prisoners, and it doesn't negotiate." The chamber erupted into chaos as it had for the past 3 sessions. Species blamed each other for the intelligence failures, and the inadequate defenses, and the treaties that had perhaps made them too soft for a threat like this. Archivist Thelm sat in the observer's gallery, his 6 eyes scanning through the ancient database that only his order was permitted to access. The Valasian species had kept the records of the Concordat since its founding, and Thelm had spent his entire life among the archives. He had been searching for something and anything that might help. Old weapons treaties and forgotten defense pacts, and research into extinct aggressive species that might offer insight into the swarm's behavior. File was marked with a seal he had never seen before. Classification levels that shouldn't exist in a society built on openness and cooperation. Restricted Species Protocol, the header read. Emergency contact procedures, extreme threat response only. Thelm's manipulator appendages trembled as he opened the file. The document dated back to the early Concordat, when the founding species had been exploring and cataloging worlds with vigorous enthusiasm. They had found thousands of species at various stages of development, most of whom would eventually join the galactic community. But some species had been marked differently. The Korthax of Sector 88 were noted as too aggressive and permanently quarantined. The Dreven Collective was deemed incompatible with cooperative civilization. And then there was entry 2847-3. Sol System, 3rd planet, locally designated Earth, Thelm read. Dominant species, humans, bipedal mammalian. Persistence, predators. Classification, Omega restricted. Status, emergency use only. Warning, do not contact under standard circumstances. Warning, containment protocols must be established before any interaction. Warning, full psychological and military analysis attached. Review required before any engagement decision. Thelm felt his respiratory systems accelerate. An Omega classification was theoretical, and something he had only read about in the most ancient protocols. He downloaded the full file and made his way down to the council floor, pushing through the shouting delegates. "Premier Savik," he called out, "I have found something." The chamber slowly quieted as the Premier acknowledged him. "Speak, Archivist Thelm." "There are protocols," Thelm began, his voice steadier than he felt. "Ancient protocols for situations. Exactly like this. Our founders encountered species they deemed too dangerous for standard contact, but potentially useful in extreme circumstances." He transmitted the file to the central display. The warning symbols alone caused several delegates to recoil. "This is forbidden knowledge," Council Member Vrath objected. "These classifications were sealed for good reason. Our reasons for existing are about to be consumed by the swarm," Commander Korath growled. "I want to know what the archivist found." Thelm expanded the display, showing the location of Earth, some 2,847 light-years from the council chambers, in a sparse region of space the Concordat had never developed. The species is called humanity, he explained. They were evaluated 800 standard years ago, during what the observers termed their medieval period. The evaluation team spent 10 years watching them and studying their development and psychology. The display showed images captured by long-range observation drones. Humans in primitive armor, fighting with metal blades and siege weapons. Humans crossing vast oceans in wooden ships to explore and trade and conquer. Humans building cities and destroying them and building them again. The evaluation concluded that humans were persistence predators who evolved by chasing prey animals until they collapsed from exhaustion. Thelm continued. This trait translated into every aspect of their civilization. They do not give up, and they do not accept defeat, and they find creative solutions to impossible problems. The team noted that human military history showed an alarming pattern of adaptability and innovation in warfare. They recommended isolation and restriction, with contact permitted only in the event of an existential threat to the Concordat itself. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Predicted we might need them, Ambassador Telrin asked quietly. Yes, Thelm replied. But they also warned that once contacted and once integrated into galactic society, that humans would be impossible to contain or control. The report states, humans befriend easily and adapt quickly and spread like no species we have encountered. Distance is the only factor that limits them. Contact will result in permanent integration into any civilization that engages with them. Premier Savik studied the file for a long moment, her crystalline structure pulsing with the colors that indicated deep thought. So our founders left us a weapon we could use only if we were willing to accept the consequences. It appears so, Thelm agreed. Commander Korith stood. I have fought the swarm for 3 months now, and I have watched it consume everything in its path, without mercy or hesitation. If these humans are as dangerous as this file suggests, then perhaps that is exactly what we need. I vote to invoke the Emergency Contact Protocol. The debate that followed lasted 6 hours. Some delegates argued they should face extinction, rather than unleash something their wisest ancestors had feared. Others pointed out that the evaluation was 8 centuries old, and surely humanity had evolved beyond their primitive nature. Still others suggested that any species that could frighten the founding members of the Concordat was worth the risk. In the end, the vote was close, but decisive. The Emergency Contact Protocol was invoked by a margin of 7 votes. Premier Savik authorized the deployment of a diplomatic vessel to Sol 3, with a simple message prepared in the mathematical language that any technological species should be able to decode. We are the Concordat of civilized worlds, and we face extinction from an enemy we cannot defeat alone. We need your help. You answer. The ship departed within the hour, jumping through dimensional space toward a small yellow star, where a species designated emergency use only had been waiting for 800 years, without knowing the galaxy even existed. As Thelm watched it go, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had just changed the galaxy forever. The swarm was coming, and would consume them all as left unchecked. But perhaps what they had just awakened would be even harder to stop. The ancient evaluators had been clear. Humans could be useful, and humans could save them. But humans could never be contained. They were about to find out if salvation was worth the price. The detection happened at 03:47 hours Universal Coordinated Time, when every radio telescope on Earth simultaneously picked up the same signal. Dr. Sarah Chen was the first to notice the pattern in the noise, her hands shaking as she ran the decryption algorithms her team had prepared for this exact moment that nobody really believed would ever come. It's mathematical, she whispered into her headset. Someone is broadcasting prime numbers, and then basic arithmetic, and then she stopped as the message decoded itself on her screen. Within 6 hours, the United Nations Security Council had convened an emergency session. Within 12 hours, every major government on Earth had confirmed the message was real, and not a hoax, and not a mistake. Humanity was not alone, and the neighbors were asking for help. General Sarah Okonkwo stood in the UN Situation Room, surrounded by holographic displays showing military readiness across the globe. Veteran of 3 international peacekeeping operations, and had commanded forces in the largest joint military exercise in human history just 2 years prior. Nothing in her experience had prepared her for this. "They say they're sending a ship," the UN Secretary General explained. "It will arrive at the moon's orbit in approximately 60 hours. They request a delegation to meet them there, and they emphasize that this is a peaceful contact, but that time is critical." What exactly are they asking for? General Okonkwo studied the translated message again. Military assistance against something they call the Vorosh Swarm. Admiral Chen from the Pacific Fleet responded. "The translation is rough, but it sounds like they're facing an extinction-level invasion. And they're asking us for help?" Someone laughed nervously. "Shouldn't it be the other way around?" Dr. James Rivera cleared his throat from his position at the end of the table. As the world's leading xenoanthropologist, a title that had been purely theoretical until 18 hours ago, he had been rushed to New York from his university office. "That's what concerns me," he said carefully. "If they have faster-than-light travel, and what sounds like an interstellar civilization, and they're asking a species that hasn't left its own solar system for military help, then either they're desperate beyond measure, or what?" the Secretary General asked. "Or there's something about us they think makes us useful in a fight." The room fell quiet as everyone considered the implications. The diplomatic vessel arrived exactly on schedule, a sleek craft that seemed to bend light around itself as it decelerated into lunar orbit. The human delegation launched from Earth's surface in 3 separate shuttles, a precaution suggested by military advisors who still weren't sure this wasn't an elaborate trap. General Okonkwo led the military contingent while Dr. Rivera headed the civilian scientific team. When they entered the alien vessel through an airlock that adjusted itself to accommodate human dimensions, they found themselves facing beings that looked nothing like the science fiction films had predicted. Archivist Thelm resembled a 6-eyed starfish made of flexible crystal. Ambassador Korith was a massive 4-armed creature covered in ridged armor plating. Premier Savik appeared to be living geometry, her form shifting slightly as she moved. The translation devices worked surprisingly well, though there was a slight delay as the computers processed idioms and cultural context. "Thank you for responding to our message," Premier Savik said. "We understand this contact violates your natural development timeline, but we face an existential crisis." General Okonkwo nodded slowly. "Your message said you need military assistance, and we're willing to discuss that, but first, we need to understand what we're facing, and why you think we can help." What followed was a 3-hour briefing that left the human delegation stunned. The Concordat represented 47 different species, spread across thousands of light-years. They had maintained peace for 3 millennia through cooperation and mutual defense treaties. The Vorosh Swarm was unlike anything they had encountered, a hive-mind entity from another galaxy that consumed biological matter and used it to create more of itself. 17 worlds had fallen, and billions had died, and the Concordat's conventional military forces were losing badly. "I still don't understand," Dr. Rivera interjected during a pause. "You have energy weapons, and faster-than-light ships and thousands of years of technological advancement. What can we possibly offer?" The alien delegates exchanged what might have been uncomfortable glances, though it was hard to tell with beings so different from humans. Thelm finally spoke up, his translation device conveying hesitation. "We have reviewed your historical records, specifically your military history. Your species has a unique approach to conflict. Unique how? General Okonkwo asked. You don't stop, Commander Korith said bluntly. We have watched recordings of your battles and wars and conflicts throughout your development. Other species fight until the cost exceeds the benefit, and then they negotiate or retreat. Humans fight until they win or until they physically cannot continue. You call it determination, Thelm added. Our psychologists call it alarming. The human delegation sat in shocked silence. You're afraid of us? Dr. Rivera asked slowly. Not afraid, Premier Savick corrected. Concerned about the long-term implications of contact. But yes, your species has capabilities that our founders deemed potentially dangerous. You were classified as an emergency use only resource. General Okonkwo felt a chill run down her spine. How long have you known about us? 800 of your years, Thelm admitted. We have been observing from a distance, ensuring you were left undisturbed unless absolutely necessary. You've been watching us this whole time? Admiral Chen's voice rose. Watching us fight world wars and develop nuclear weapons and nearly destroy ourselves, and you did nothing? The protocol was clear, Korith responded. Contact would lead to integration, and integration with humans would be irreversible. Your species spreads and adapts and befriends too easily. You can't be contained once released. Released? General Okonkwo repeated. You make us sound like a weapon. Perhaps you are, Savick said quietly. Perhaps that is what we need right now. 4 hours as technical details were discussed and shared. The Concordat offered technology transfers, including improved power generation and medical advances and manufacturing techniques. In exchange, they wanted military advisors and combat troops, and most importantly, human creativity in warfare. Our military doctrine is 3,000 years old, Korith explained. It is based on efficient force application and minimal casualties and strategic resource preservation. The swarm does not follow these rules, and we do not know how to fight an enemy that doesn't calculate cost versus benefit. But you do, he gestured to the humans. You have fought enemies that didn't care about losses. You have developed tactics for asymmetric warfare and guerrilla combat and what you call total war. General Okonkwo looked at her fellow delegates. She thought about human history, about the trenches of World War I and the island-hopping campaigns of World War II and the insurgencies and counterinsurgencies that had defined modern conflict. Humanity's military history was written in blood and determination, and the absolute refusal to accept defeat. If we do this, she said carefully, we do it our way. We won't just be advisors, and we won't follow tactics that aren't working. Agreed, Savick responded immediately. We are invoking emergency protocols that give you broad operational authority. We need you to fight the way humans fight. Dr. Rivera leaned forward. And after the war, if we survive? The alien delegates were quiet for a long moment. That is the question our founders could not answer, Thelm finally said. The emergency protocol was designed to save the Concordat, but not to deal with the aftermath. Once you join us in fighting the swarm, you will know you are not alone in the universe. Once our peoples meet and work together and bond over shared struggle, separation becomes impossible. The founders predicted that humans would spread throughout the Concordat, making friends and trading and integrating until containment was impossible. So you're gambling your entire civilization, Dr. Rivera said, on the hope that we can save you from one threat, while accepting that will become a different kind of change you can't control. Yes, Premier Savick said simply, we are desperate, and you are our emergency option. Will you help us? General Okonkwo stood and extended her hand, in a gesture the aliens had clearly researched. Korith reached out with one of his forearms, and gripped her hand carefully. We'll help, she said. Humanity has never been good at sitting on the sidelines anyway. As the human delegation returned to Earth to begin the largest military mobilization in history, Dr. Rivera couldn't shake the feeling that they had just stepped into something much larger than any of them had predicted. Agreed to change not only human destiny, but the destiny of the entire galaxy. The aliens were afraid of humans spreading and befriending and integrating. They had kept Earth isolated for 800 years to prevent exactly that. But now, they had no choice. They needed the one thing humanity had always been disturbingly good at: fighting wars that seemed unwinnable and refusing to give up until they found a way to win anyway. The emergency protocol had been activated, and humanity was going to war among the stars. What happened after the war was anyone's guess. The human fleet emerged from dimensional space 3 weeks after the diplomatic agreement was signed, and the Concordat military observers, watching from the fortress station of Theraxis 4, didn't know what to make of what they were seeing. 23 ships had been retrofitted with Concordat jump drives in a crash program that should have taken months, but that human engineers had completed in days through methods that made the alien technical advisors nervous. The ships themselves were primitive by galactic standards, basically armored boxes with chemical rockets and kinetic weapons. What impressed Commander Korath as he reviewed the fleet roster was not the technology, but the audacity. Every human military vessel capable of leaving Earth's gravity well had been committed. Destroyers and carriers and submarines that had been modified for void operations, and supply ships, and even 2 hospital vessels. They sent everything. Observed. Their entire planet is now defenseless. No, Korath corrected. They sent everything because they don't plan to need defense. They plan to win. The briefing room on the Concordat flagship was crowded with representatives from 17 different species, all watching as General Okonkwo outlined the human understanding of the tactical situation. The swarm operates like a biological infection, she explained. Holographic displays showing the enemy's advance patterns. It sends out scouts, establishes beachheads, and then floods the area with massive numbers while consuming local resources for reproduction. Your current doctrine focuses on meeting them in space with superior firepower. Yes, Admiral Thren of the Corvassian Defense Fleet confirmed. We establish kill zones and eliminate as many sworn units as possible before they reach inhabited worlds. But they just keep coming, General Okonkwo said. And every battle costs you ships and resources you can't easily replace, while they can convert biomass into more units in days. You're fighting a war of attrition and losing. The Concordat officer shifted uncomfortably because it was true. What do you propose? Korath asked. General Okonkwo's expression was grim. We stop fighting their kind of war and start fighting ours. We identify the beachheads and command nodes, and we go after them directly. We board their vessels, and we plant explosives in their breeding zones, and we make every meter they advance cost them more than it costs us. That's suicide, someone objected. Swarm vessels are filled with hostile biological matter and acidic atmosphere. Yes, a human marine colonel named Davis agreed, which is why we volunteered. What followed over the next 6 weeks would be analyzed by Concordat military historians for generations. A disaster by conventional standards. 3 human ships and 1 Concordat cruiser attempted to raid a swarm beachhead on the mining colony of Vestia II. The colony was already lost, with its population consumed, and the swarm using its facilities to produce more units. The plan was to destroy the breeding complex and slow the swarm's advance. 2 of the human ships were heavily damaged in the approach. A Concordat cruiser was destroyed when a swarm bioweapon breached its hull. Normal doctrine called for immediate withdrawal. The humans ignored the order to retreat. The surviving human destroyer, the USS Perseverance, moved into close orbit and deployed its entire marine complement in drop pods. 200 soldiers fell through acidic clouds into the heart of a swarm breeding ground. Korath watched the helmet camera feeds in horror as human marines fought through conditions that would kill most concordat species within minutes. Atmosphere burned exposed skin, and swarm warrior forms attacked from every direction, and the heat from the breeding pools was extreme enough to fail most of their equipment. 70 Marines died in the first hour. The survivors kept pushing forward, fighting room by room and corridor by corridor until they reached the central breeding chamber. They planted fusion charges and fought their way back out. Only 43 Marines made it back to the extraction point. But the breeding complex was destroyed, setting the swarm's operations on Vestia 2 back by weeks. "They're insane," Admiral Thren whispered as he watched the after-action reports. "No," Korath said quietly. "They're exactly what the ancient evaluations said they were. They don't calculate acceptable losses the way we do. They calculate whether the objective is worth any cost, and then they pay it." The second major engagement came at the Thoraxis system. Had committed a major fleet to overwhelm the defensive stations. The Concordat had been preparing to evacuate and cede the system. General Okonkwo convinced them to make a stand. The battle lasted 73 hours straight. Human ships fought in patterns that baffled Concordat tactical doctrine, breaking formation to pursue individual targets and sacrificing optimal firing positions to protect damaged Allied vessels. When the human carrier Indomitable lost power and began drifting toward a swarm capital ship, its captain ordered all but essential crew to evacuate the aft sections. Then he fired maneuvering thrusters and rammed the carrier directly into the swarm vessel's command structure. Both ships were destroyed in the collision, but the swarm's coordination in that sector collapsed. Concordat forces exploited the opening, and the system held. The cost was staggering by their standards: 8 human ships destroyed or damaged beyond repair and over 2,000 casualties. But Thoraxis 4 remained in Concordat hands, and 3 million civilians were safely evacuated. "They bought us 3 days to evacuate with their lives," the station commander reported. "They held positions that were tactically indefensible just to give us time. I asked their ranking officer why they didn't retreat when the situation became untenable. She said, because people were counting on us." As weeks turned into months, the pattern repeated across a dozen systems. Human forces took casualties that would break most Concordat units, but kept fighting. They developed tactics that made Concordat military advisors uncomfortable: boarding actions and suicide runs, and defensive stands that lasted beyond any reasonable endurance. But they were winning. The swarm's advance had slowed, and then stopped. For the first time since the invasion began, the Concordat forces were pushing back. Dr. Rivera worked alongside Archivist Thelm in the research division, studying captured swarm specimens and trying to understand the enemy. "They communicate through chemical signals and bioelectric pulses," Rivera explained. "It's elegant in its simplicity, but it's also vulnerable. We've been working on a disruption signal." Within 2 weeks, human communication specialists had developed a broadcast system that could interfere with swarm coordination. When deployed in battle, the effect was immediate and devastating. Swarm units that normally moved with coordinated precision began attacking each other in confusion. The Concordat had been fighting the swarm for months and never considered biological warfare. Humans had suggested it in their second week. On the research station, Thelm reviewed the ancient evaluation files again. "Your people evolved as pursuit predators," he said to Dr. Rivera one evening. "Prey for days, running them to exhaustion before making the kill. You brought that same persistence to warfare." Rivera nodded slowly. "We have a saying: humans are persistence hunters who learn to throw rocks really accurately. Everything we've built as a civilization comes from that basic template. We don't give up, and we adapt to any challenge. It's kept us alive through ice ages and plagues and countless wars. Your founders were right to be cautious about contacting us, he added. Not because we're aggressive, but because once we're part of something, we don't leave. We make friends and we integrate and we spread, because that's what persistence predators do. We find a niche and we fill it completely. Thelm's crystal form pulsed with colors Rivera had learned to recognize as concern. What happens when this war ends? If we survive, Rivera asked. When we survive, Thelm corrected. Don't think in terms of if, Rivera smiled. I imagine we'll do what we always do. We'll help rebuild, and we'll make friends, and we'll probably end up scattered across the Concordat, making everyone nervous. But isn't that better than extinction? In the Tactical Command Center, General Okonkwo was planning the next phase of operations with Commander Korath. The two had developed a working relationship based on mutual respect and shared combat experience. We've stopped their advance, Korath said, studying the strategic display. But to truly defeat them, we need to find their staging grounds and destroy their capacity to reinforce. That means going on offense, Okonkwo agreed. Deep penetration raids into occupied territory. It will be dangerous, and the casualty rates will be severe. I know, she replied, but that's never stopped humans before. We didn't come all this way just to hold the meeting. We came to win. Korath looked at the human general with his 4 eyes and finally understood what the ancient evaluation team had meant. Humans were dangerous, not because they were violent or aggressive. They were dangerous because they were relentless. They made friends easily, and they integrated into any social structure, and they never gave up on anything they cared about. Once you let them in, they became part of you. The Concordat had opened the door out of desperation. Now they would have to live with the consequences. But as Korath watched the tactical displays showing the swarm's retreat and the joint human Concordat forces advancing, he found himself thinking that perhaps those consequences weren't so terrible after all. The ancient evaluation had warned that humans would spread throughout the Concordat, making friends and integrating until separation became impossible. Looking at the human and alien soldiers, working side by side, sharing rations and stories and combat tactics, Korath realized that process had already begun. For better or worse, humanity was now part of the galactic community, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Emergency Council session convened 4 months into the joint military campaign, and for the first time since the swarm invasion began, the mood was not one of despair. It was concern of a very different kind. Premier Savick called the session to order with her crystalline form pulsing the colors of diplomatic urgency. We face a situation that requires immediate attention, she announced. Our human allies are winning the war, but in ways that were not authorized and in places that were not agreed upon. The holographic display showed a dozen star systems where human forces had conducted operations without Concordat approval. The USS Valiant and 3 allied Concordat ships pursued swarm forces into the Keldor Nebula, Admiral Thren reported. That region was designated as a loss, abandoned to the swarm weeks ago. They ignored recall orders and penetrated deep into occupied space. What did they find? Someone asked. A swarm, hatchery complex, and approximately 40,000 survivors from the Keldor colonies hiding in underground shelters. The humans evacuated all of them and destroyed the hatchery. They lost 1 ship and took heavy casualties, but they brought those people home. The council chamber was quiet for a moment. That is good news, Ambassador Telrin said hesitantly. Then why does Admiral Thren sound concerned? Because they disobeyed direct orders, Thren replied. Because they committed forces to an objective that command had not approved. Because they decided on their own authority that those lives were worth saving, regardless of strategic considerations. Commander Korath stood from this position. With respect to the Admiral, that is exactly why we contacted Earth in the first place. Humans don't abandon people, and they don't calculate lives as acceptable losses. It makes them difficult to command, but effective in ways we cannot match. It also makes them dangerous, Councilmember Vrath interjected. We gave them limited authority to assist in specific operations. Instead, they are conducting independent missions and ignoring the chain of command, and making tactical decisions that affect the entire war effort. Premier Savik brought up another report. Human engineering teams have been reverse engineering swarm biotechnology. In 3 weeks, they have made progress that our researchers predicted would take years. How is that possible? Someone asked. Dr. Rivera stood from the human delegation section. We approached the problem differently, he explained. Your teams were trying to understand the swarm's biological systems completely, before attempting any modifications. Our teams just started cutting things apart and seeing what happened. It's faster and messier, and occasionally results in explosions, but it produces results? You're experimenting on active swarm organisms? A Concordat scientist asked in horror. In containment facilities, yes, Rivera confirmed. We've identified 3 separate mechanisms for swarm communication and 2 vulnerabilities in their reproduction cycle. We're weaponizing both. The council erupted into arguments about research ethics and proper scientific protocols. Felm sat in his observer position, reviewing incident reports with growing concern. Human psychological warfare specialists had begun broadcasting messages to occupied worlds where swarm forces were present. They mixed disruption signals with recordings of human music and speeches, and something they called motivational content. The effect on swarm coordination was significant, but more interesting was the effect on any survivors in those areas. People who had been hiding and waiting to die suddenly began fighting back after hearing human voices, promising that rescue was coming. They're giving people hope, Felm realized. Even in situations where rescue is impossible, they broadcast these messages. Is that ethical? His assistant asked. To promise help that may not arrive? I don't think humans see it that way, Felm replied. They promise help, and then they find a way to deliver it, even when the odds are impossible. It's not false hope if they actually show up. In the Tactical Command Center, General Okonkwo was having a heated discussion with Concordat High Command. You ordered my ships to withdraw from the Tertian system, she said, her voice level but firm. I countermanded that order. You don't have the authority, Admiral Friend began. I have the authority granted under the emergency protocols, Okonkwo interrupted, which give human forces operational independence when civilian lives are at stake. There were 2 million people on Tertian Prime. The swarm was 6 hours from the main population centers. You wanted to evacuate command personnel and abandon the rest. We didn't have the resources to evacuate 2 million people. Thren's voice rose. Neither did we, Okonkwo replied. So we made the swarm's advance so costly, they withdrew instead. 3 human ships and 5 Concordat vessels held the orbital space long enough for ground teams to organize the civilian evacuation. It took 40 hours, and we lost good people, but we got everyone out. You took casualties that were completely avoidable, Thren argued. If you had followed orders and withdrawn when instructed, those 2 million people would be dead, Okonkwo finished. I understand that you calculate acceptable losses differently than we do, but humans don't accept that some people are expendable for strategic convenience. Commander Korath entered the command center, and the argument paused. General, I need to speak with you privately. They moved to a side office, where Korath closed the door. The Council is discussing limiting human operational authority, he said without preamble. Some members believe you have become too independent and too difficult to control. Okonkwo leaned against the desk. Are you here to relieve me of command? No, Korath replied. I'm here to warn you that if humans continue to operate outside approved parameters, you may find yourselves excluded from decision-making. The Concordat is not accustomed to allies who don't follow instructions. Commander, with respect, we didn't come here to follow instructions, Okonkwo said. We came here to win a war. Your instructions were losing. Your tactics were failing. You asked for human help because you were desperate, and now you're upset that we're actually helping effectively. Plating shifted. In what she had learned was his species equivalent to the Psi. The ancient evaluation warned us this would happen, she said. That humans would be impossible to control once integrated into our civilization. You're not trying to control us in combat, Okonkwo countered. You're trying to control how we care about people, and that's not something humans are good at limiting. We see someone in trouble, and we help. We see an impossible situation, and we try anyway. You can't train that out of us, and you can't order us to stop. Back in the research division, Dr. Rivera was showing Thelm something that made the archivist's crystal form pulse with alarm. You've been teaching other species human tactics. Rivera gestured to a classroom, where human Marines were instructing a mixed group of Concordat soldiers. They asked to learn, he explained. After seeing human boarding teams in action, several Concordat units requested cross-training. We're teaching close-quarters combat and improvised explosives and survival techniques. You're spreading human military doctrine throughout the Concordat forces, Thelm said. We're sharing what works, Rivera corrected. But yes, the effect is that Concordat tactics are starting to incorporate human approaches. Is that a problem? Thelm watched as a Zalathian soldier practiced the human technique of controlled aggression under the guidance of a Marine instructor. The founders warned that humans would integrate and spread and change everything they touched. I'm watching it happen in real time. Would you rather we hadn't come? Rivera asked quietly. Thelm took a long time to answer. No, he finally said. You saved billions of lives and turned the tide of a war we were losing. But you've also made it impossible to return to the way things were. Cultural elements spreading through the fleet. Music and humor and traditions. Human phrases are being adopted into common usage. Human concepts of loyalty and determination and refusing to give up are influencing how other species think. You're not just fighting alongside us anymore, you're changing us. Is that so bad? Rivera asked. I don't know, Thelm admitted. Ask me again when the war is over, and we see what kind of galaxy we've created. In deep space, a joint human Concordat task force was preparing for the largest offensive operation of the war. Intelligence suggested the swarm's main staging area was located in a dense asteroid field near the galactic rim. The plan was to jump directly into the field, destroy the staging facilities, and jump out before swarm reinforcements could respond. It was the kind of high-risk operation that made Concordat military planners nervous. Every human officer, immediately. This could end the war, General Okonkwo addressed the assembled forces. Or it could end us. The swarm will throw everything they have at defending this position. We're going to be outnumbered by factors we can't calculate and fighting in conditions that favor the enemy. Standard doctrine says this operation has a 15% chance of success. She paused and smiled. Good thing humans don't trust standard doctrine. We've been beating impossible odds since we crawled out of caves on Earth. This is just another impossible situation that's about to become possible because we refuse to accept any other outcome. The Concordat forces cheered alongside the humans, their voices mixing in a chorus of determination that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. Commander Korath stood beside General Okonkwo as the fleet prepared to jump. The Council may try to limit human authority after this operation, he said. Regardless of whether we succeed. Then we'll deal with that when we get back, Okonkwo replied. Right now we have a war to win. I'm glad we're fighting alongside you, Korath said. Even if you're impossible to command and completely change everything you touch. That's the nicest thing anyone said about humans since we got here, Okonkwo laughed. The fleet jumped together into the unknown, human and alien forces united in purpose, if not in doctrine. The Concordat had wanted help from a restricted species classified as emergency use only. What they got was a partner who refused to be controlled, but who also refused to let anyone face danger alone. The ancient founders had been right. Humans were impossible to contain, but perhaps that was exactly what the galaxy needed. The combined fleet emerged from dimensional space directly into the heart of the swarm's staging grounds, and for the first few seconds, nobody could breathe. The asteroid field was alive. Thousands of swarm vessels clustered around massive biostructures that pulsed with the rhythm of industrial-scale reproduction. Breeding chambers the size of moons floated among the rocks, connected by organic bridges that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. "Contact!" multiple sensor operators called out simultaneously, swarm response forming on all vectors. "All ships, execute dispersal pattern Omega," General Okonkwo ordered. "Make them chase us through the asteroids and break up their formations." The fleet split into a dozen groups, each one led by human vessels whose captains had been practicing high-speed asteroid navigation for weeks. The swarm forces pursued, their coordination perfect and their numbers overwhelming. Asteroids broke up their attack waves, and the narrow passages between rocks negated their numerical advantage. Human destroyers led swarm vessels into ambush points, where Concordat cruisers waited with charged weapons. Concordat carriers deployed fighter wings that harassed the swarm's larger vessels, while human marines prepared for boarding operations. "Target the breeding chambers," Commander Korath transmitted. "Destroy their production capacity, and we end this invasion." 12 strike teams launched simultaneously, each one targeting a different breeding facility. They flew through acidic clouds and hostile fire and biological defenses that had been designed to kill anything that approached. 8 teams made it through. The fighting inside the breeding chambers was brutal. Human Marines and Concordat commandos fought side by side through chambers filled with immature swarm organisms and defensive drones, and conditions that pushed both species to their absolute limits. Technical Sergeant Maria Santos led her squad through a pulsing corridor toward the central chamber of Breeding Complex 7. Her team was down to 6 soldiers from the original 12. "Charges set," Corporal Kim called out. 2 minutes to detonation. They turned to fight their way back out and found their exit blocked by swarm warrior forms. "Alternate route," Santos ordered. "Move, move, move." They ran through side passages that weren't on any map, following Santos's combat instincts and sheer determination. The building shook as other teams' charges began detonating across the facility. They burst out of an emergency airlock 30 seconds before Complex 7 exploded, the blast catching their escape craft and throwing it spinning into space. Concordat recovery ships pulled them from the wreckage. All 6 survived. Across the battlefield, similar stories played out. Ingenuity and Concordat technology combined to achieve what neither could accomplish alone. "We're not going to destroy all the breeding facilities," Admiral Thren reported, as the battle raged into its 3rd hour. "They're too dispersed and too well defended." "Then we change the objective," Okonkwo replied. "Human teams, this is General Okonkwo. New mission priority. Instead of destroying the facilities, capture swarm communication nodes and biological control specimens. We're taking samples home." "What are you planning?" Korath asked. "If we can't destroy their staging grounds, we make it impossible for them to use it," Okonkwo explained. "Dr. Rivera's team thinks they can create a targeted biological agent that will make this entire area hostile to swarm reproduction. We seed the asteroids with it, and this staging ground becomes useless." "That will take weeks to develop," Thren objected. "4 weeks," Okonkwo said simply. What followed was the longest sustained military operation in Concordat history. The joint fleet established defensive positions throughout the asteroid field and fought off wave after wave of swarm counterattacks. Supply ships jumped in and out, bringing reinforcements and materials. Human engineers and Concordat scientists worked around the clock in mobile laboratories, developing the biological weapon while battles raged around them. Dr. Rivera barely slept during those 3 weeks. The swarm reproduces through a chemical catalyst process, he explained to Thelm during a brief rest period. We're creating a competitive inhibitor that will bind to the same receptors. Essentially, we're making the environment toxic to their reproductive cycle, without affecting other biological processes. Can it spread to other systems? Thelm asked, concerned. Only if someone deliberately transports it, Rivera said. Assured him. It's tailored specifically to the chemical composition of this asteroid field. You've learned biological warfare remarkably quickly, Thelm observed. We've been doing it on Earth for centuries, Rivera said tiredly. Mostly against crop pests and invasive species. Scaling it up for an interstellar threat is new, but the principles are the same. Your species is terrifyingly adaptable. Our species survives, Rivera corrected. We find solutions, because giving up isn't in our nature. On the 23rd day of the siege, the biological agent was ready. Human ships dispersed it throughout the asteroid field, while Concordat forces covered their approach. Within hours, swarm breeding chambers began to fail. Within days, the entire staging area was compromised. The swarm attempted one final massive assault to reclaim the position, but the joint fleet held. When it became clear they couldn't retake the seawall staging grounds, the swarm forces withdrew, retreating back toward intergalactic space. They're running, someone whispered in the command center. We won, another voice added, stronger. The celebration that followed was subdued at first, as soldiers who had been fighting for months couldn't quite believe it was over. Then gradually the realization spread through the fleet and across the Concordat. The invasion was over. Billions of lives had been saved. The victory came at terrible cost. The human fleet had lost 16 of its 23 vessels. Over 8,000 human soldiers had died in the campaign. Concordat casualties were even higher, with entire species having lost significant portions of their military forces. But they had won. Back on Earth, the news was received with mixed emotions. Pride in what humanity had accomplished, grief for those who wouldn't return, and uncertainty about what came next. The emergency council session convened 1 week after the victory, and this time the agenda was very different. We must address the human question, Council Member Vrath began. During the crisis we granted broad authorities and accepted integration out of necessity. Now we must decide how to proceed. Some have suggested that Earth should return to restricted status, Premier Savick said. That humanity should be asked to return home and limit contact with the Concordat. The human delegation sat quietly, letting the Concordat members debate. How exactly do you propose to enforce that? Commander Korath asked. There are human soldiers stationed on 40 different worlds, human engineers working in our shipyards, human doctors in our hospitals, human teachers who have been invited to our schools. They haven't conquered us through force. They've integrated through friendship and collaboration. Cooperation. Exactly as the ancient evaluation predicted, Vrath said, which is why containment is necessary. Thelm stood slowly from his observer position. Council, I have completed my analysis of the human integration over the past 6 months. With your permission, I will present my findings. Savick granted permission, and Thelm brought up his data. Humans currently represent approximately 0.3% of the population in Concordat space, he began. But their cultural impact is significantly higher. Human music has become popular on 17 worlds. Human food and cooking techniques are spreading through our civilian populations. Human phrases and idioms are entering common usage. Human concepts of determination and loyalty and refusing to give up are influencing how other species approach challenges. This is exactly what we feared, someone said. Is it? Thelm asked. also analyzed our military effectiveness before and after human integration. Casualty rates among Concordat forces have decreased by 40% when operating alongside human units. Mission success rates have increased by 65%. More importantly, morale and esprit de corps have reached levels we have never recorded before. Humans don't just fight for objectives, they fight for each other, and they extend that loyalty to anyone they serve with. It's infectious, in the best possible way. He brought up another display, showing civilian surveys. Public opinion polls show that 73% of Concordat citizens view humans favorably. 68% want increased human presence and cultural exchange. The people we claim to govern don't want humans isolated. They want them as neighbors and friends and colleagues. Because humans have saved billions of lives, quietly. Not just through military action, but through medical assistance and engineering solutions, and simply refusing to abandon anyone. The founders were right that humans would integrate and spread and change everything. But perhaps they were wrong about whether that was something to fear. General Okonkwo stood to address the council. When you first contacted Earth, you told us you needed help. You were facing extinction, and you had no other options. We came because that's what humans do. We see someone in trouble, and we help. We fought alongside you and bled alongside you and built friendships that none of us expected. If you want us to leave, we'll leave. But we won't forget you, and we won't stop being who we are. And I think in a few years, you'll find yourselves facing some crisis, and wondering if maybe you should call Earth again. Because now you know we exist, and you know will. The council chamber was silent for a long moment. Finally, Commander Korith stood. I move that we offer Earth full membership in the Concordat. Not restricted status and not probationary membership. Full equal status with all rights and responsibilities. Seconded, Ambassador Telrin added immediately. The debate that followed lasted 6 hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The vote was unanimous. Earth would join the Concordat as a full member species. The emergency protocol was officially concluded with a note that Thelm insisted on adding to the historical record. Emergency protocol status, successful. Containment, impossible. Recommendation, complete integration. Note: the ancient founders feared that humans would spread throughout the Concordat, making friends and adapting and changing everything they touched. They were correct in their assessment. To predict was that this would be the Concordat's greatest strength rather than its greatest weakness. Humans have taught us that determination and loyalty and refusing to abandon each other are not just survival traits, but the foundation of a civilization worth saving. They were classified as emergency use only,